So the goal of this one thing is to focus on one idea that can help us get policy unstuck. And really, it's a chance for us at Cast from Clay to share some of the excellent work that our clients are doing with their policy and research communications, and give a bit of a behind-the-scenes look of what it takes to adopt some of these ideas. So today, the theme is taking a campaigns approach to research communications, and we are very fortunate to be joined by Michael Victor. So Michael has worked for 20 years in research communications and is currently head of communications and knowledge management at the International Livestock Research Institute, or ILRI as they're more regularly known. ILRI is a CGIAR, I knew I was going to mess that up, CGIAR research center, and describes—
Just don't say CGIAR, you know, like the cigar.
Research Centre, and describes itself as working for better lives through livestock in developing countries. Their strands of work include livestock and nutrition, climate, and human and animal health. And ILRI's campaign-oriented work has aimed to spotlight livestock in global food system policy discussions as a lifeline for many people, families, and communities in the developing world. So you'll be hearing more about these campaigns as we tease them out in the communication, in the conversation that will follow. So we at Cast from Clay began working with Michael and ILRI around 2 years ago. I think I've got the maths right there. And the majority of this work has been spearheaded on the Cast from Clay side by our moderator, Natallia Nenarokamava. Natallia is lead consultant at Cast from Clay, specializing in strategic digital communications on projects ranging from website builds to global campaigns. And before joining Cast from Clay, she worked in strategic communications at the UK government's Foreign Office. So I'll shortly hand over to Natallia to lead this conversation with her client and, shall we say, co-conspirator, Michael. And they'll spend the first half of our time together sharing how the process of moving towards a campaigns approach has been for ILRI, maybe some of the highs and lows, some of the behind the scenes intel, and hopefully give you a bit of a sense of what the kind of day-to-day of this work takes and what the process looks like. So during this conversation, if it helps you to kind of focus on what you're hearing, you're very welcome to switch your cameras off if that makes it easier and more comfortable for you. Though we do encourage cameras on during the kind of Q&A in the end part of the session, so that it can feel a little bit more conversational, and we'd love to meet you and hear from you. You're welcome to share questions in the chat as you go in preparation for the Q&A towards the end. But we'll also be inviting participants to kind of raise hands and come off mute to ask a question if you prefer to kind of make it more conversational for yourselves. So I've talked for far too long. So Natallia, Michael, welcome and thank you. And I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Katie. Thank you, Michael, as well, for joining us today. It's really nice to have this conversation. I know that it's extremely busy period for your team right now with so many events. But to be honest, I'm really glad to have this chat because we're currently working and stepping in quite a big strategy work together. And just looking back at some work that we've done before, I think it's a really nice just a space to reflect on what we've done. I have a series of questions. I'm going to be really old school in the digital age, so I'm going to look at my papers sometimes. And
I have paper too, so
good. Yeah. And then we'll open up the floor to our guests today. We have quite a lot of people joining from different organizations, and it's quite a nice, diverse group of people that we've got from, I know, some think tanks, some foundations, trusts, and NGOs, and it'll be quite interesting to compare our experience. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to kick off with a question, Michael. What do you think is ILRI's one thing? Like, how would you define what you do differently to other research organizations? I know we gave it away slightly in the title, but yeah. I'm curious to hear how you would define it.
I mean, I think for us, ILRI's vision, it's one of the few times in an organization where I've seen we have a very succinct and very clear mission, which is better lives through livestock. And I think, you know, just to kind of give a background about ILRI as well, ILRI focuses on, you know, sustainable livestock systems in the developing world or low and middle income countries. We're not talking about industrial livestock systems, particularly in the global north, that are very unsustainable and creating a lot of the problems that we'll talk about later in the discussions about, you know, why we're doing advocacy the way we're doing it. And I think The other thing is we talk about better lives through livestock, and we talk about sustainable livestock systems in low and middle income countries. And I think what makes ILRI unique for a commodity or technical research based organization is that we have three objectives. And one of those, the first two objectives are really about, producing kind of new, technologies, new systems, improving livestock systems. So really the technical side of the livestock production, but then, and also capacity building to partners in the global South. But then our third, or one of our main objectives is to influence decision makers. And those are all types of decision makers, from a farmer to a policymaker or to an investor. And I think that's really important and sets us apart from many of the other technical research institutes, because we have a focus on influencing decisions or informing decisions from different decision makers. So I think it's really something that sets us apart, and then really provides an entry point for communications and advocacy to have a really clear role within the organization, and not just be about kind of corporate communications or resource mobilization.
Yeah, thanks so much for this intro. I think it was really helpful. And I'm going to pick up on something you said. So you mentioned that obviously ILRI's focus is on sustainable livestock. Yet, do you think it's fair to say that the issue around the conversation around livestock, that's especially is often happening in the West, is potentially rather controversial or potentially unpopular? And I'm wondering, how do you tackle that? Like, what do you do when you are actually voicing something that facing a very strong opposition?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've done, and we'll probably talk about this later in the conversation as well, is to try to, we don't want to be defensive in our conversations and in our communications. We're not trying to win the debate or even take on some of the, the vociferous kind of anti-livestock discussions that are happening in the West. And some of that's for really good measure. I mean, the CAFO systems, the industrial livestock systems, particularly in the global North and in industrial systems are unsustainable, and they're the practices that they have for animals are terrible, and they should be improved, and they do harm the environment. And again, this gets also linked to, and we can talk about this later on, to diets and unhealthy diets. And again, there's a diversity of systems, and in the global South, livestock and animal source foods are really an important aspect of food security and nutrition. Whereas, yes, of course, in the North, there is a need to, reduce kind of meat consumption. But, we have to see this from different kind of points of view. And as one of our old directors used to say, looking at a topic is where you stand. And I think that's what we try to show, is that there's a nuance to the debate, and we're not talking about all systems. And when we talk about that, what we want to talk about is the diversity of livestock systems, and show that in some instances you really have to improve those and actually invest more in those. And we also want to, amplify the good and kind of reduce the bad. So I think that's really how we try to address it. And we don't try to tackle it head on with people who have a kind of more of a political position, or a position that cannot be moved. And that's one of the things that we try to focus on.
And sort of campaigning and advocacy is sort of one of the methods to do that. And I'm curious to hear, like, how did you get to that point for a research organization? Because working with policy sort of think tank, in the think tank world, we quite often see the fear that associated with the word advocacy, right? Mainly maybe sort of linked to the issue of non-partiality, or the bias trying to advocate for certain issues. How did this transition happen for ILRI? And because I know you're definitely not afraid of the word advocacy, you're maybe a little bit cautious about using it, but could you talk us through where did it start? How did it start?
Yeah, I'd also kind of, before we started, I'd like to talk a little bit, take us back and look at the continuum of types of research organizations. So again, like I said, ILRI is a technical research organization on, focused, and in the beginning, focused really on, working on diseases, vaccines, and livestock productivity. And it's really expanded its kind of its remit and its portfolio later on. But I think there's a very difference between technical research organizations and scientific research organizations versus, let's say, a policy think tank or a thought leadership or a policy type of research organization who's much more used to getting into policy discussions, orienting their research towards policy or investors and everything, and having those discussions and having those debates. And we have one of my colleagues used to work at a think tank in Washington, and he's come to ILRI and he's like, oh my God, before, I had all my researchers wanted to get onto the TV or get onto, have an op-ed in the media. Here, no one wants to do it because they're scientists. And I think there's always this, concern about scientists, which is really important. Where is the line between advocacy and lobbying? And I think this is a real big issue. So you have this continuum of like actually starting from science, okay, here's the science and we're going to provide that to you, and that's where we end. And then you have a bit of engagement and advocacy where you get involved in a process and you're supporting kind of like different policymakers or different groups to help them along with decisions and provide them evidence-based information. And then you get into lobbying, where you're lobbying for a position. So I think we have to see what we're doing along this continuum before we start. And for ILRI, the journey started, from a real science-based organization to moving into how do we again influence that objective that I provided. And I think the reason that happened was because of really of this kind of the controversy of livestock and how livestock has really become kind of a lightning rod for kind of the climate, environment, and diets. And this started in about 2006 with a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, which really kind of lumped everything together and didn't differentiate the different systems, and really became a lightning rod for a lot of the controversies around livestock. And we started seeing that. We saw that as more of a Western issue, I would say, in the beginning. From what I've understood, I only joined ILRI 3 years ago, but in the beginning, people started to see that it was affecting, investments and affecting people's perceptions about livestock and what we were doing actually in the, kind of the developing world or low and middle income countries, and it was infecting investments and infecting kind of development in a negative way, because livestock provides so many benefits to livestock keepers and to rural livelihoods, to nutrition, to health, that those benefits were not being seen with all the bads that were being produced. So I think that's where we started off, and it was, I can talk about that journey right now if you want, or should we move on to another question?
Yeah, I actually had a question maybe from a little bit your personal perspective. I found it generally quite interesting that you say that policy and think tank researchers are more inclined to do campaigning. I would be quite interested to maybe open it up for discussion later. Mm-hmm. But you said that it's potentially harder to get researchers on board. So how did you, obviously report came out, that conversation had to happen, or how do you have this conversation? How do you rebalance it? And how did you bring everyone on board? And I'm quite curious also to hear maybe Michael, your personal story with ILRI, whether you've noticed some change in how people engage with evidence and how people engage with the word advocacy.
Okay, well, I mean, I think what's, and I'd like to have a shout out to my colleague, Cynthia, who's our kind of advocacy specialist as well. And I think, and she's been one of the kind of powers behind how we've moved the dial in the last 2 or 3 years as well. I think one of the things from my perspective, at least from communication, and this is where Cynthia and I work very well together, it's how do we see engagement and what's our outcome and our theory of change as we've been working on lately, but what's the outcomes that we want to see in terms of engagement and advocacy versus what's the communication objective. So, if we set those higher level objectives, or what are the outcomes in terms, do we want more investments? Do we want to improve policies? What types of improved investments do we want? What types of improved policies, or what changes in the discourse do we want to see? then we can set our communication objectives. And we set those alongside with Cynthia, who's doing a lot of the engagement and working with different stakeholders as well. So it's working about side by side, and I think that's a really important part of our approach. I think, like I was saying with ILRI, which has been really interesting, is this journey that we've taken from a real science-based organization. So what happened is that we started realizing that there was a problem, and we started engaging more in the issue of sustainable livestock and trying to defend it and bringing the evidence. And one of our kind of deputy director general, Shirley, was doing a lot of this at meetings, and she met with some people from the Gates Foundation who also see sustainable livestock in low and middle income countries as a real pathway out of poverty. And they were seeing some of the problems as well, and they wanted to bring more evidence to the discussion. And so we combined forces and created this project on global livestock advocacy. And in the beginning, it was all about, we started this journey the first couple of years from about 2014 to about 2016, was all about how do we gather the evidence? Can we gather the evidence on the benefits of livestock in the developing world for different, not just about increasing productivity, but how does livestock contribute to sustainable development, livelihoods, climate, gender, youth, all these different issues. So gathering the evidence, and that took about 2 or 3 years. It was really an evidence-based kind of approach. And then we started to learn how to communicate that. So how do we package that? And, that was kind of like after about 2019, when Cass from Clay started to come in, was how do we develop kind of innovative communication processes? How do we actually start to really kind of use this information in a new way? And then we're actually now in a new phase. We're really looking at, and really with what Cynthia's doing, is engagement processes. So how do we engage and influence the right events and link kind of global level kind of policymaking? So you're looking at things at what's happening in the COP to national level policy and investment processes. So we're becoming more nuanced. So moving from kind of the evidence base to communications and now to engagement and influencing. And just kind of the final thing, that kind of the other pillar that we've really worked on, or 2 other pillars. One is that we've seen that evidence is great. It's great. We need to have the evidence. We need to have the right stats and the right evidence as to why, how livestock is beneficial. But now we've also seen that we need to have the solutions. So if you have the evidence and you want the investments, what are the solutions that are investable? So we're really starting to work on that. And also, as we start to engage more, start to have more of an alliance and partnerships with livestock champions, as well as with people who are aligned to who see livestock as a benefit. So they're not, they're what we call allies, people who are outside the livestock sector, but understand the importance of livestock in development, and then working with them.
Great, thank you, Michael. I want to go into a little bit more detail about our work together and take you back two years ago when we first met. I'm just also aware of jumping. We have this conversation on a regular basis, and people are just joining and trying to put things together from how we actually started doing campaigning. And I think, do you remember when you first reached out to us? And I'm just gonna remind you, we published the 21st, we published a while ago, 21st Century Communications Model for Policy Communicators, where I don't know if everyone on the call is familiar with it. If not, Katie, I'm sure you'll share the link. And the idea behind the model was that we basically said that in the center of any research and policy communication should be a story. And everything, all your communications and engagement should be focused around telling the story. And you reached out to us saying, this is what we want. Can you help us do that? Can you talk us through how you came across it, and where ILRI was at this stage? Why did it speak to you?
Okay, I guess, so as we were kind of moving through this approach from kind of innovative communication processes, we realized we wanted to move away from the one-off event communication campaigns and the report campaign. So you have a report that you want to launch, or you have you want to do something at COP. How do we move beyond that? And actually, we saw a tweet from you. One of my colleagues, Peter Ballantyne, had seen a tweet, and he shared it with us, and we read the blogs, and we're like, oh, we can do this on our own. This is looks pretty simple, and we liked the kind of funnel that you had, the funnel diagram of how you go about doing it. And I don't know if this will bring back nightmares, because Cynthia just joined at that time, and we went through this process. This was right during the pandemic, this was 2020. Right at the pandemic, and we work on ILRI. One of its kind of core strengths is One Health, and what we wanted to do was use the evidence around One Health to create a campaign around the issues around One Health, and end up with investable solutions. So we actually started with kind of like message briefs. What were our key messages, and around One Health, and that was going to build up this kind of campaign and maybe some partnerships, and we were then going to do some case studies, and then we would have the investable solutions campaign ready.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, it sounds reasonable. And no, it didn't work at all. It pretty much failed in some ways. We have really good products from it, but it took a lot longer than we thought, because we thought, okay, we move away from a report, which takes 2 years, and how do we do that, right? And so we would have these kind of intermediary products going. And yeah, and it took, getting messages and getting the researchers to come up with these message briefs and work them through it. And, oh, wait, we don't have the evidence for that. How do we make kind of real statements and recommendations? So that took about, 3 or 4 or 5 months longer than we wanted to. We didn't get to the case study so much. And then we did an investment report, again, where the researchers had a hard time kind of pinning down what are the solutions, and then what are the concrete investments. I think the products we came up with, and they're on our website, and if someone can put up the Why Livestock Matters website, you'll see it, all that information there. And I think they're really great products in the end, but we weren't able to create the kind of that kind of flow and what we wanted to see. And that's why we reached out to you all, as we wanted to kind of really now test out an approach and work with you on that. So that's how it came.
I'm going to ask a couple of follow-up questions. So how do you feel the process was different, and the results, whether they were different or not, and expectations of working on your own and just trying to use our model, or working with us? But just to give everyone context here, so the way we started working with ILRI is we first created a storytelling handbook. So we looked at everything that ILRI been doing, and we asked the question of how do we actually tell a human story to back up this evidence, so that it reverberates with people. And there were some interesting conversations, Michael, that we had, and one of them sort of stayed with me, is this disagreement that we had around emotional storytelling versus human storytelling. I don't know, Michael, if you remember that, and why did it cause such dissonance with researchers?
Yeah, sorry, someone just called, and let me just give this to my daughter because it's for her. Let me just get this really quickly, sorry.
Right.
As we all know, these things happen nowadays. Yeah, I think, so yeah, the issue, there was the issue around the human-based messaging. I think for us, again, we're used to messaging, evidence-based messaging, and having the facts and figures and getting that right. And I think what was really, for us, what was really important, I wanted to start with that first actually, was when we were working with you, working in partnership with a consultancy company, I think is really important, because when we try to do it on our own, we're also busy. And we have so much, we're doing so many different things. It's really important to have that outside check, I guess, and it's, and to get new insights and new ideas as to how we can do things, and also help push things along. So I think that's what we saw as really important, and to use the right tools. I think, oftentimes we all know, at least for me as a communicator, we know a lot of the tools that we need to use, but we're just too busy sometimes to really sit down and use them. So it was, I think for us, that was a really important part of the process when we started, was to have a much more systematic process that, you guys were helping guide us through, and in that we could have this kind of go back and forth with. And then, yeah, I think with the big kind of new idea that you introduced to us was, yeah, we had the evidence, and you can go to whylivestockmatters.org and you'll see all the evidence we had, but we had never kind of thought about combining that with the, what you call the emotional messaging. And that's scary for us. And I think it was even scary for me as a research communicator to talk about, emotive messaging. And I think, a lot of us kind of at that point were a little bit concerned about, and researchers, oh, what, we're going to talk about emotions now? How do we quantify that or create evidence around that? And then I think that's where we came up with this concept of human-based messaging.
Yeah.
And it's about the storytelling, and it's about how we actually go about, telling the stories and really combining the cases that we have, the stories of people with the, with the evidence base. I mean, just a side note, many years ago, I was working on water issues in the Mekong in Southeast Asia, and we did a very large documentary that was on the Mekong. And, this was really to kind of show some of the impacts of hydropower development along the Mekong and what the impacts it was having, and have a conversation, again, much more of an advocacy perspective, have a conversation around sustainable hydropower and what it means. And, some technocrats and scientists, saw the film, and they said, there's too much emotion in it. There's too many crying people. There's too many people complaining in the movie. And yeah, I mean, it's this thing that I think a lot of technocrats, everyone wants to see evidence, but actually people don't want to understand what the impacts are and the faces behind the people. And I think combining, and I think you'll show this in a second, combining both the facts and the figures and the evidence along with the human story that's what's really important.
Yeah, I think as you're talking, actually, it's also a question of what kind of emotion you're sharing and what kind of emotion you introduce through a campaigning. And I think we've been very careful and learning as well with working with ILRI of how do we get the right sentiment across, and how do we especially stay away from portraying Africa, as a poor, necessarily country and environments, and people like we just need to feel sad. That wasn't the intention behind the campaign. We took a very different path. And that actually leads us to the section where we just wanted to look at some assets that we created, some campaigns that we worked on together. And the first one was the campaign called Food Choice is a Privilege, that we run around UNFSS at that time. Michael, do you want to give a little bit of context for this project, and how did it all come around? And then I'll ask a couple of questions.
Okay, yeah, so this came about, it was about around a lot of our work for the UN Food Systems Summit, as well as for a report that we were doing on animal source foods and its importance to nutrition and livelihoods and food security. And at this kind of was the focus about, there was a report by the Eat Lancet group, these planetary dietary guidelines that came out in about 2019 that really kind of juxtaposed that we need to eat less meat. And it didn't, again, provide a nuanced story for what needed to happen in the developing world, where you actually need more animal source foods for protein and whatnot. And so we wanted to really create a understanding of that, again, that, in different places, you need different things. We can't just have one planetary guidelines, and what we found was if you, in different studies, you'll see that if we did you take those planetary guidelines, there's very few people that could actually use it because it's so expensive. And, in the developing world, and of course, in rural areas, it would never go. You can't just, have soybeans and, soy milk and falafel everywhere. It's, the issue is that, we need diversity of choices, and we need to have sustainable diets, accessible. And, I think this was the discussion with you. I think you guys came up ultimately with a couple of different choices, and one of them was food choice is a privilege. We saw this as very bold, and we're actually quite scared about this.
Yeah, that was one of my questions. I remember a lot of, it felt uncomfortable. Like when we had the discussions around the tagline, there were a lot of people like, oh, we're not sure about it. What did you think helped to bring everyone on board, and why did you go for this one?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think what, again, and from my own experience, I think what, it's about testing. So I knew in my organization, if we just proposed this, people would get really scared and they would we'd have all these discussions. And by the end of it, we would come up with a word mush of all the jargon words that would become the campaign, sustainable, healthy, inclusive, protein rich, whatever diets, equitable diets. So it would be this, really kind of mush word choice. But so I've kind of learned that, when you want to have these decisions, and a research organization, if you show evidence, it will help. And so what we asked you to do is to do some message testing and test with some of our donors or partners or stakeholders what they thought. And, food choice is a privilege. Came out as a bold choice that people were really interested in and seemed to really like. So we were able to present that to our management and say, hey, this is the one that everyone seems seems to resonate with people. And because we had that evidence, I think people were a bit more comfortable with actually then going with it. And I think what we found is that it seemed bold to us now or then, and I think it's still a great tagline. I think it's one of the best ones that I've ever seen because it's very evergreen. We've used this now for 2 or 3 years, and I think that's another important part of this is that it's not just a campaign for 6 months, but you can come back to this material and constantly use it.
It's interesting that you said, I never thought of it this way, but actually as comms professionals, we were using research as tools to bring everyone on board for this one. It's just like, okay, let's do some evidence.
Yeah.
Let's get the evidence on this one. And if you
I think that's a key point is that we forget, and a lot of development professionals and others forget that communications is a science. It has a set of practices, approaches, methods, and tools that you use. And if you use those correctly, you'll get usually a better output. And there's science and evidence and research that you use to actually derive what you want to do. And I think they forget. They think that, oh yeah, I just want this color red, or this sounds good and we should use it. And it's usually much more personal based than evidence based.
Michael, how was sort of campaign perceived, like compared to internal anxiety of going out with this message, linking it to the data and the report? Was this a justified fear? What was the feedback that you received, and what was the results of them? Were they what you expected, really?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe at some point we can also bring Cynthia in if she has some comments and thoughts on these as well, because I'd like to get her perspective as well. I think from my perspective, what it really kind of set a new, for at least for ILRI too, a kind of a new way of doing things, and and showed what you can do now with messaging and with campaigning, rather than just having, okay, here's a report and here's what we're going to say about that report. It was really, this was bringing a lot of our content, our evidence, and our information together and putting that into a campaign. So for us internally, it was really important. I think externally, it really was the debate now about kind of animal source foods, in healthy diets is now much more better recognized. And I think people have started to see that food choice is a privilege. And I think there was a lot of people doing this as well. I think we contributed to a more nuanced discussion around healthy diets and the role of animal source foods in different kind of settings and different contexts. And I think it's much more accepted now within the dietary movement. We still have big issues and a lot more work to do around environment, but I think this campaign contributed both in the UNFFS and in other fora to a much better understanding. And even in the EAT Lancet, they're going to be doing a new planetary guidelines too. And now we have like 3 or 4 scientists from the livestock world who are part of that. So I think we were able to really do that. We didn't have like great stats, and I think that's one of our kind of weaknesses. Still about how do we measure our contribution? Yeah.
I mean, this is something we're working on right now. Of how do you actually quantify the impact. Cynthia, I can't see you, but feel free to jump in and unmute yourself and put your camera on. I know you constantly hold us to account, like this is the kind of campaign, this kind of sentiment we are looking for from you guys. And I just have one more follow-up questions in terms of the role, the data you think plays in this. And Katie, if you can change the slide just to give us an example. What do you think, Michael, is the biggest challenge when the numbers come in? Because there were a lot of nuanced discussions that we had to get these graphics right. Because when it comes together with quite a bold tagline, statement type of tagline, data has a different color to it, rather than when you print it as a PDF report. How did you feel about it? Like, did it feel different? And what role do you think data plays in campaigns like this?
I mean, for this one particularly, like even in this one, it's, this is, and one of the concerns that we had is we didn't want to create a polarity, but we kind of did. I mean, there is, you can see there's like global north versus global south, and what is global south? And, I mean, that's what I think we were a bit kind of concerned about with this type of diagram, that it's juxtaposing two things and creating kind of a bipolar world rather than a more nuanced picture. Because, I mean, animal protein intake in some instances, in very industrial countries in Africa, like let's say cities, resource rich areas, are going to be, they are taking in too much meat. I mean, we have the Middle East in there, which probably shouldn't be in there. So it's how do you create that nuance? If you had this hodgepodge of things, it would be very difficult to see. So we tried to, I mean, I think extracting that, and for researchers, it's difficult, and we want to get exact. We're research, and I think it's an important thing. We're not a advocacy organization, but a research institute. So for me personally as well, we have to be very clear about that we're using evidence, and that we're not just putting out facts, and we're not being too bold. We have a responsibility to be an evidence-based organization. And so we have to get it right. And I think that's really important compared to maybe an advocacy organization, is that, the evidence and the way that we do things is a bit more staid and risk adverse. And, we want to keep our position, because also ILRI is a respected organization, as seen as a bit, I mean, it's not neutral. We're a livestock, we're pro livestock in certain instances, but, we want to maintain our integrity in that sense.
Yeah, I actually can see a couple of questions coming in, and I'm going to open the floor for everyone to come in with questions in a second. And I think so Melina is asking, what were the specific assets and deliverables created? And I think what's important to note here is that we never, like, we're showing individual graphics here, but we never thought of the campaign as an individual post on social media. It was always about leading people through the journey and leading people through the data, and making sure you kind of use short form messages to have a sort of a larger and more nuanced and detailed conversation. So yeah, I just wanted to bring this point out here. And there were a lot of assets, Melina, we created around sort of focusing on quotes from farmers, focusing on data, and the whole campaign was actually quite a comprehensive storytelling on the issue. Michael, just really briefly, how do you feel? This was the first campaign we worked on together, and then we did three more campaigns. How do you think the approach changed, and what do you think, has it become easier? Because from my perspective, I feel like after this one, we went quite bold and we were quite brave in terms of what we could suggest, and ILRI was very receptive to everything. Was it the sort of similar feeling that you had? And actually, we might share one more example from the recent campaign that we did. Kate, could you bring up the cow in the room one?
I mean, as you're doing that, like, Cynthia, do you have any thoughts or comments about that and how it's kind of involved? Are you still there? Or I think I see her on, but just wanted to, because it would be interesting to, yeah, there you go. Cynthia, I see her on. Good.
Sure, and I'm not sure you can see me well. I'm in the office, but thanks everyone. And Cynthia, I work very closely with Michael. I think the only thing I can add, Michael, about how the way we have framed the narrative is we have deliberately tried to make our messages in the campaign personal. So and that for us has helped in drawing in unusual partners and extended our reach, if I can put it like that. I think that's, otherwise, I think, Michael, you've covered it all. I think that's one aspect that we do more deliberately.
Thank you, Cynthia. This is really good comment, because one of our, I think every time ILRI comes to us, it's in your brief. How do we engage people we don't usually talk to?
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting for me is how the sentiment, sort of the tagline and the approach in our campaign changed depending also on the climate and the sort of environment of international debate. So we need to talk about the cow in the room was a bit less about it's us versus them. It was, let's get in the room and acknowledge what is good and what is bad. And ILRI was very open about you know, also negative impact that intensive livestock has on the environment. I'm going to open up the floor to anyone who might want to jump in with questions, both to Cynthia, Michael, and our team, should you have any.